Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for Drying Up the Freshwater Crisis in Florida, presented by John Dunn and hosted by the Winter Park Health Foundation in collaboration with Ideas for Us, grassroots environmental nonprofit and NGO. I'm Kaylin Garreau, Program Coordinator with the Center for Health and Wellbeing in Winter Park, Florida, and I will be your program host. Joining me as a moderator this evening is Lee Perry, Chief Operations Officer of Ideas for Us. Before we begin, please be aware that during the course of any Center for Health and Wellbeing program, we respectfully ask that all participants keep in mind that all are welcome here. We request that you hold space for differences in thoughts and values, that all audience members listen deeply and actively, and that you suspend judgment while having the courage to raise questions and to reflect on the information imparted. Within the next 24 hours, you will receive a post-program evaluation survey via email. Please take a moment to complete that. Your feedback is important to help us serve you, our community, in the most impactful way possible. Please be assured that your privacy is of utmost importance, and we promise your information will never be shared nor sold. It will only be used to evaluate existing programs and help us create some new ones. We encourage you to submit your questions via the Q&A feature in Zoom. John will be answering questions toward the end of the program, and Lee will be moderating for us. And lastly, please be aware that this program is being recorded, and a link to that recording will be sent to you once it is available online. Again, thank you all so much for taking the time to join us this evening. We're thrilled to welcome John Dunn, Florida-based freelance writer, educator, and water advocate. John is the author of numerous nonfiction books and articles for publications such as the Ocala Star Banner, Business Florida, the St. Petersburg Times, and many others. His most recent book, and the focus of this evening's program, Drying Up the Freshwater Crisis in Florida, is the winner of the Florida Book Award's 2019 Florida Nonfiction Bronze Medal and the 2019 Florida Historical Society's Stetson Kennedy Award for Environmental Writing. So we're all in for a fascinating look into Florida's natural water systems and how each of us can make a difference in their preservation. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce John Dunn.
Good evening. Thank you, Kaylin, and thank you, Lee, and thanks to both of your organizations for inviting me to talk about my book here. And I also want to thank all the participants for breaking away from the latest release on TV about what COVA is up to. So I'm going to tell you about my book, and I'm afraid there's some bad news here too, except I promise you this, I start off in kind of a minor key in a musical way of speaking. That's the key of the blues, but about halfway through, I'm going to transition through to a major key, and things will pop up because I'll try to tell you some solutions and new approaches to water problems. So my goal is for the next 30 to 40 minutes to give you an overview of Florida's water problems and solutions, and to give you an idea what the book is about. And I want to also stress that my book was meant to be a readable guide for people who are new to the state and don't understand the history of our environmental problems, especially water, and for those of you that want to get in the game and become water advocates. I've been a very active magazine writer in my adult career, and I first started writing about water in 1997 when I wrote the cover article for the international edition of the Rotarian magazine, because in the 90s, people were projecting global water problems even then, and 80 countries at the time were experiencing water problems. But water has grown more than 2 times since then, water demand that is, and the population is expanding as well. Today there's more than 2 billion people who actually lack access to safe drinking water. And the projections, if we stay on the status quo track, we are going to reach a point, not just here in Florida, but in the United States and across the world, of having too little water for the natural world and for human beings. Or at least we're going to have a scarcity of affordable water. This is a map of the world. There are 37 aquifers. Aquifers are those underground water storage areas that nature gives us. And this was done by the Jet Propulsion Lab. And it shows the impact that humans are making on the underground water supplies. Anything that's a warm color over here is not good news. That means people are extracting groundwater at a rate faster than the aquifer can be replenished or recharged. And if you notice, we live right here in one of the critical areas. Out of the 37, 21 are near or at the tipping point. Here's another way to look at it. If trends continued as they were before the pandemic came, we could expect this in the next 10 years, that these areas will have enough water in Florida. Central Florida and South Florida will be empty, and the other areas will be running low. I want to point out, a lot of you are in the Orlando area, people in the water world and government and the private sector will tell you, and the studies indicate this, you passed the tipping point a couple of years ago. How could this be? Florida is, by some reckonings, the wettest state in the United States. But as Tom Singleton, a water consultant, figured out for me, we receive 55 trillion gallons of rain every year, and we only use 1 trillion. The rest of it's wasted, or it's washed out to sea. And we appear to be running out of water. So how could this be? I'm going to quickly go through a bunch of causes. One is that we just have increasing numbers of people coming to the state, and later in the presentation, I'm going to give you a specific study to cite some statistics for you. But for right now, we keep putting more and more straws or pipes in the ground, and we're extracting a lot of water from the aquifers, and we're seeing the results already. For example, of the 1,000+ springs in Central and North Florida, over 1/3 of them have shown an average decline of 32% in pumping power in recent decades. I live about 5 miles from Silver Springs, and this is no longer a first magnitude spring. The amount of water that bubbles up has been reduced by 30 to 40%. There are lots of reasons, but spring scientists that I know very well are utterly convinced it's because we pump too much water out of the aquifer. Sometimes water actually dries up spectacularly. Here is a picture of White Springs on the Swanee River in 1914. This is in Northeast Florida in Gilchrist County, and people from around the world would come and bathe in these waters. This is what it looked like in 2005. No people, no water. The reason, a nearby phosphate mining company pumped too much groundwater out. By the way, if you're new to Florida, you might not know this. Some states get most of their drinking water from rivers and lakes. We don't. Most of our drinking water comes from the ground, but increasingly water managers are wanting to tap the surface waters. In states like California, it's just the opposite. It's not just overpumping though. Our freshwater infrastructure is also in trouble. It's old, it's leaky, and it's wasteful. Some pipes in Florida are actually 75 years or older. Every year, the American Society of Civil Engineers puts out a report card on infrastructure for all the states in the country. And every year, our water infrastructure gets a rating of D. It's not just that. We also waste a lot of water. When I first saw this, I was astounded. 50% of the water that we use every day from the public supply, now that doesn't mean all the fresh water, but the amount of water that's allocated to the public for our water in businesses and at home and so forth is spent watering grass. Nationwide, it's about 40%. Sometimes we have droughts in Florida. That might come as a surprise to people who have moved to the wettest state. In fact, droughts were so bad in the 1970s that one of the consequences was that people got up and changed the laws in Florida and gave us some of our water and environmental laws that are still on the books. Florida might look like Eden, but we have polluted water too, just like Ohio or any other industrial state. We have loads of nutrients, which sounds good, such as nitrogen and phosphorus, but as most of you probably know, this is what's making algae go crazy, too much of these nutrients. We also have dangerous bacteria, a whole cocktail of industrial chemicals that are in our water supply. In fact, we have over 1,700 impaired water bodies in Florida. I ask some of my friends in the environmental community sometimes this question. I'll say, how many Superfund sites do you think we have in Florida? And now, Superfund site is a major industrial dump with chemicals leaking into the earth and polluting water supplies and environment and everything else. And my well-schooled friends will often say, well, this is a tourist state, so none. No, the answer is 92. We have 92 Superfund sites that are waiting for the federal government to be cleaned up. Stormwater is the water that is created when the rain falls. Stormwater is water that courses over sidewalks, lawns, fertilized golf courses, and so forth. It collects all the pollutants and contaminants and ends up in a retention pond like this one but in the middle of the downtown area of Edgewater, Florida. And I don't know how that poor little gator got in there, but it's, for the most part, stormwater is not treated. It is not cleansed. This water is about 600 yards from Tampa Bay, and it's going to be evacuated directly into Tampa Bay and carrying all its pollutants. And as we have more and more development in Florida or any other place in the world, you have more and more concrete and more asphalt, you're going to have more and more stormwater running off as wastewater. We also have problems with wastewater. Wastewater is a bit different in terms of recognizing what it is. This is water from our toilets, it's from factories, it's also from farming productions and other things. This water, by law, has to be treated. But there are different levels of treatment. The best is called advanced treatment or tertiary. But even if you have the most advanced water treatment at one of these 4,000 treatment places, treatment plants in Florida, that doesn't mean they get all the stuff out. Very often there's still trace amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus, bacteria, and the federal government doesn't even require water treatment plants to take out pharmaceuticals, ingredients such as Viagra and other pills that have sex hormones and so forth. That gets into the water supply, it gets into animals, and it's all over. And as you may know, every year, industry is coming up with hundreds of new plastics, hundreds of new chemicals that are being dumped into our environment, and the government just can't keep up regulating. Even if the wastewater is treated, what do you do with the leftovers? If you don't like it, you call it sludge. If you do think it's something useful, you call it a biosolid, and it can be useful. This is what's left over, these little nuggets. They are used as fertilizer. In fact, about 3/4 of all the biosolids in Florida are used as some kind of fertilizer. The downside is they are concentrated nuggets of nitrogen and phosphorus, and often cyanobacteria and heavy metals and other things, which aren't so good. If farmers use this wisely and the plants absorb all the nutrients, then it's not a problem. But all too often they over fertilize. What's not used will eventually leach down into the aquifer underneath the farm. Septic tanks are the fastest growing of nitrogen in Florida. Our human excrement emits nitrogen. It's not just fertilizer, or fertilizer tends to be phosphorus, but if you have nitrogen in your water, it often comes from an excrement of a cow or a horse or a human. If you have a septic tank, it's probably never or rarely inspected by anybody. The stuff inside eventually leaks out. It goes through a drain field, which is okay, it's designed to do that, but if for a variety of reasons that stuff continues to migrate underground and gets to the water supply, you have problems. Studies have been done that estimate that 40% of all the newcomers who are coming to Florida will hook up to septic tanks. We can be proud of the fact that we have 12% of the nation's septic tanks in Florida. Even when you convince people that being on a septic tank isn't the best thing for the environment and people will hook up to a sewer system, there's still problems there too. Because our sewage system also gets a D every year from the engineers. They too are old and they're under siege as more and more people put more and more demands on them. And we have sea level rise that's also putting pressure in heavy storms, which will inundate these systems with water, cause them to back up. And when they back up, we have sewage spills in Florida. Fort Lauderdale has a continuing nightmare with this, for example, but it's not alone. There have been 23,000 sewage spills in Florida since 2009 up to a few months ago, with enough untreated sewage to fill 2,400 Olympic swimming pools. Algae is a worldwide problem, and it is considered a contaminant by many biologists because there's just too much of it. Here's what Kings Bay Crystal River, which should be crystal clear, looks like from the sky. that the algae has just taken over, gone crazy. Here's what it looks underneath the water at Heart Spring in 2007. This is a common sight at almost all the springs now. The algae will grow and kill the natural aquatic life. It takes oxygen out of the water. It hurts amphibians and fish and other creatures. And too much algae in the drinking water supply can also be harmful to humans, especially young children. When I was a boy in the 1950s and 60s, it wasn't uncommon for us to hear about red tide, but usually it was concentrated down here in the southwest part of the state. It's caused by a natural occurring microorganism. But today we have red tide appearing all around the coast of Florida. That's not normal. And scientists are busy trying to figure out why, but I think they agree that too many nutrients flushing from the interior of Florida to the coastline are also feeding the algae cousin that causes red tide to occur. And as some of you live in this area know, this is a real killer of marine life. Florida is the #1 state at risk for sea level rise. Talk to the people in Miami and other coastal areas. It's not theoretical to them. They already understand because it's already happening. Flooding during sunny days, incredibly high tides during the king tides, and flooding when storms occur. We all can understand that with sea level rise, salt water encroaches from the coast, and probably in the imagery of a lot of people's minds, it's the idea of a flooded basement or your living rooms being inundated with water. But if you're new to the state, you might not realize that there's salt water underneath the state. Probably where you're sitting right now, there's a freshwater supply, aquifer, freshwater aquifer. Underneath that, way down deep, is brackish water, and still deeper is salt water. As sea levels rise, and they push and they pressure all this water on top, make it go up. At the same time, we seem to be really busy pumping water out of the aquifers. That further reduces the pressure at the top. The big problem is, especially in South Florida, that the water level, underground water level, keeps rising. And as it does, it comes into the drain fields of septic tanks, which is polluting the water supply. And there's less earth above it to absorb all the rain when it comes. So we see increased flooding, and stormwater rushes out to the sea in a contaminated form. I know you're tired of hearing about COVID, but just very briefly, I want to give you just a couple examples that our water supply is also being impacted by this pandemic. And how it's going to play out in the long run is anybody's guess. But I read some of the industry trade journals on this topic. And one thing that's really concerning is that the water utilities, whether they are private or public, are under financial stress because people have lost their jobs, have economic problems, and they can't easily make their monthly payments to the water utility company. So some places, the companies are taking the policy, well, okay, just pay when you can. But the problem with that, with the shut off of revenues or diminishing of revenues, these utilities are having increasingly new problems and challenges on how to supply fresh water to people at a reasonable cost for several years to come. There's more, but that's one of the big ones, I think. Okay, now all those sad things that I just told you do not compare with this one. When I talked to scientists, and by the way, I interviewed over 100 people over several years to get this information. And of the scientists that I talked to, at one point they would say, listen, everything you said is important, but that's not the biggest threat to our water supply. No, the biggest threat is the constant destruction of the natural hydrology. Natural hydrology is the natural water cycle components. We all know that we were taught in 4th grade that it rains, water gets in the aquifer, it's stored by trees, there's evaporation, it rains, it starts all over again. But human beings have been busy destroying things. Here's one image to think about. When a developer comes to a virgin forest and cuts down 1,000 acres. It's bad that the habitat for animals is destroyed. It's really sad that our aesthetic sentiment has been violated. But when those trees come down, they are big tanks that store water. Their roots keep the soil in place and keep it from eroding. Those forests and plants provide a cooling effect. And there's evaporation that takes place when you have this pooling and saving of water, which goes back up in the sky and continues the cycle. But when you do things like this, come in and clear cut and destroy all those silos, those trees containing water, you are greatly upsetting the natural hydrological system. And in my book, I give you the sources for these quotes here, but just a couple real fast. 67% of the Earth's forests and wetlands are already gone. In Florida, 50% of our wetlands have disappeared in the last 60 or 70 years. And a study, which I'm going to show you in a few minutes, predicts that if current trends continued, or as they were before the pandemic hit, by 2060, 1/3 of Florida could be literally paved over. People use that as a figure of speech, but they mean it literally. I'm from Miami originally, so I can pick on my hometown. This is a hydrological disaster. I don't have to mention to you where does the rain go when it falls, hits all that concrete. It floods this area. That water goes into this man-made canal, and they try to evacuate it to Biscayne Bay. But the problem is, increasingly, that because of sea level rise, these canals down in South Florida are having trouble emptying into the ocean because the ocean is becoming higher than the canals. Miami-Dade commissioned a grand jury to figure out why Biscayne Bay was so polluted, and you can read it. It's available, the study and the conclusions, but their conclusion was the #1 source of pollution was stormwater. Because I think so few people understand the history of Florida, or nonetheless our environmental problems, I added a chapter about the history of Florida as it pertains to water. In my research, I came across a startling fact one time. It was a study, it was in the New York Times, and it said that Florida was #1 in the United States for having the highest percentage of residents who were not born in the state. Over 60% of the people in the state right now were not born here. And in Miami-Dade, the majority of people were not even born in the United States. If you don't have most people with a background knowledge of where we've been and how we got to these problems, it's not clear that they're going to be able to address those problems successfully. So there's a lot that can be said, but 100 years ago, you would have been surprised to know that the average Floridian tried their best to get rid of fresh water. Steam-powered dredges like this were running all over Florida trying to evacuate water from the state in order to dry up land to make it available for farming and new development. So in came the great migration of people into Florida, looking for their day in the sun to get some cheap land. And it all blew up at the end of the 20s, but that was just in time for the Great Depression. So but after it was over, they got back into the development business. I think it's also important for everybody to know something about Florida's hurricane past. In the 20s, they didn't give names to hurricanes. They just referred to the year that they appeared. We had 2 killer hurricanes back to back. One of my relatives was killed in the Everglades in 1928 when his house fell down on him. Lake Okeechobee wasn't much of it was more of a dike. It wasn't a professionally made, it wasn't professionally made at the time, so it easily fell apart, and as a result, hundreds of people drowned. So when that was all over, the promoters and politicians and those in charge of Florida's destiny thought you either had to curtail development or do something about the problem. Well, they decided just to do something about the problem, which was to control flooding. This is the Everglades. We know today that it is a free-flowing, shallow, but important river. They thought it was just excessive water at the time. So at the end of those disasters, Lake Okeechobee had the Corps of Engineers come in and make a professional container for the water there. And they also set out to build 1,700 miles of canals. It's the biggest man-made plumbing engineering feat of its kind in the world, I believe. But the problem is this water really needs to go south and empty into Florida Bay and make sure that wildlife, natural systems, and increasingly people get their water. This is a projection of what people hope the Everglades Restoration Project, which has been underway for some time, will look like. When I was a boy in the 1950s, my family came over on, sorry, let me do this again. We came over on Tamiami Trail, which is the main highway right through the Everglades, to Marco Island, which was a Virgin Island in those days. It's a little bit north of Naples. And I came back in the 60s and camped on this. Not long after that camp out, development got underway. This is what it looked like. This is what Marco Island looks like today. And much of Florida has gone through that transition very quickly, just in several decades. But it's not alone. This is the Villages, which is the fastest growing development in the United States. It's not too far from where I live in Ocala. Most of it's in Sumter County, but parts of it are also in Marion and Lake County. And it all looks the same. This used to be farmland, it used to be wetlands, it used to be forest. We have a problem with growth. Our leaders have talked about it, but they sort of shrug their shoulders. But I think we might be headed for a day of reckoning. We have people that move into the state every day, and we have people that leave the state every day. But the net growth every single day is somewhere between 865 and 1,000 people. Do the math, and you see that's enough people 1 year to have a new city slightly larger than Orlando pop up in Florida every single year. Here's that study I was talking about. It came out 3 years ago. It was conducted by 1,000 Friends of Florida in conjunction with the University of Florida and the Department of Agriculture with the state government. The purpose of the study was to look at growth trends of how many people we can expect to be moving here and what kind of demand they put on the water supply. Before I tell you this, I want to give you a little perspective. At the time of the American Civil War, which is in the news so much these days, Florida had about 500,000 people. And most of the Floridians lived north of Ocala. When I was born in 1949, there were about 2 million people in the state of Florida. Today, there are 22 million people. And we expect another 15 to show up in a couple of decades. But the study didn't look at this figure. Just before the pandemic hit, we were getting over 126 million tourists every single year. The year before that, there were fewer. Just year after year, there's an increasing number of tourists and permanent residents. Our state legislature, our business community, and our governor have all recommended more people, more people, more people. They don't say where the water's coming from. Here's what Florida looks like at night because of all the growth. But many of those undeveloped areas might be lit up in the near future, because here is a kind of project that's underway in Miami. I'm going to pick on Miami again. Think I can get away with it. The county commission okayed a year ago or so to build the largest mall in North America here on the edge of the Everglades. It's more of a theme park. It will even have snow. We're talking about Miami, a subtropical place facing sea level rise, facing water shortages. And the way they're planning for the future is to create a big artificial dome and produce snow. There was also plans to have artificial lagoons and submarine rides. The Mormon Church is one of the biggest landowners in Florida. Here's Orlando, just so you can see where we are. They've had a huge ranch here for a very long time, but this is now being transformed into a city, which by 2080 is expected to have 500,000 people. There are many more, but here's just one last one. Some of you who keep up with these things may know that the state legislature and the governor have on the fast track a plan to extend the toll highway system in Florida. Ostensibly, it's to get people out of harm's way when a hurricane comes. Some skeptical people think that might be true, but it's also true they want to open up rural lands to development. And the sad thing is these highways will go through water recharge areas. I've attended conferences and heard advocates for this kind of growth admit that these are challenges, but they say Well, if Florida's population is increasing, we'll just have to grow the water pie. And this is sort of a slogan you hear a lot. What is the water pie? Well, it's a pie graph that shows the allocations of the fresh water supply to different economic sectors. You and I are here in the public supply, so you can see we get 35% of Florida's fresh water. The biggest component is agriculture. You know, if you look though at a national water pie, you would see that it's not farming, it's actually this one, power generation. About 40% of the water in the United States is used to make electricity and cool towers. I don't know if you ever thought about it, but as we have more and more electrical gadgets all the time, that electricity has to be produced. To produce electricity, for the most part, you need to have water to turn into steam. The steam turns turbines, which produce electricity, and you have to have water to cool off the towers. Who decides who's going to get water and how much is for nature and how much is for developer? A lot of that trauma and drama that takes place over these big decisions, and I've been to a lot of these meetings, and they get really hot and they're interesting. It takes place in our 5 water management districts. Florida's unique. We do not have a central statewide governing authority over water. And we've divided into 5 districts. So if you want to know more about water issues and you plan to get involved, it's really important to understand how these function. In my research, I've come across repeatedly concern expressed by intelligence agencies, governments, political leaders in the Western Alliance and elsewhere that water will be the new oil in 20 or 30 years. And there's a whole lot of examples, but time is limited right now. So I'm just going to say they anticipate, I don't know, armed conflict, but they certainly anticipate conflicts over water. And they call them water wars. In my book, I explain that we've already had water wars in Florida. And you'll have to spend some time to get the details, but Tampa has sort of a truce right now, but there's been a 3-county conflict over water there. There's been a 3-state conflict over these water basins between Alabama, Florida, and Georgia. And if you keep up within the news, you know, it looks like Florida's on the losing end, the last Supreme Court decision about how much water comes our way. A big water conflict is underway up in Putnam County, and I think some of the people watching might live in this area. If you're new to Florida, I'll say this really quickly for you. You might not know that in the 1930s, as a job creation program, the federal government tried to build something that's similar to the Panama Canal, to have a canal that goes through the state to connect the East Coast and the West Coast. But by the 1970s, this project was halted. However, some of the elements of those early construction efforts are still with us. This is a dam and reservoir in Putnam County. Environmentalists would like to see this come down for a variety of reasons. They think a fresh, naturally flowing river will make the Ocklawaha River improved. It will also enhance the St. Johns River. A lot of the surrounding territory which is flooded right now will lose those floods, and freshwater springs that are right now submerged will come back to life. And they also argue this is a waste of taxpayers' money, it's falling apart, and it needs to come down. Those that support it enjoy the recreational benefits that have developed over the years, and they want to maintain what is going on there. The biggest water war of all is the battle over the Everglades, the battle to restore Lake Okeechobee in the Everglades. It is so complex, so contentious, so many players, so many fights that I really can't go into it, but I try to make sense out of it in my book. But I think of all the battles we have, this might be the biggest. Well, now I'm going to transition slowly over to the major key. Well, I guess what I'm doing is just cataloging a lot of these problems. I imagine many of you know all these problems, or you know some of them. So what do we do with these problems, and how do we address them? If we stay with status quo, we are going to stay on the hard path. What is a hard path? A hard path to engineers is to do what they do. They build things. If you ask an engineer to help out with a water project, they're very good and all very glad to build you an aquifer, a dam, a canal, use machines and use concrete and asphalt and engineering principles. And hard path people like to suggest that we use high technology machinery to use desalination to get fresh water out of brackish or salt water, like Tampa does. I run into people who think that this is a panacea. They look at me and say, what's the problem? We got the Atlantic Ocean, plenty of water, just boil it and you got fresh water. Not so easy. Tampa, until last year, had the biggest desal plant in the United States. There's a new one in California. It works, and it's an amazing place, and it's very impressive when you go there. But the people that work there will tell you it's only one of 3 sources that provides water. It was very expensive to build. It's energy intensive, and there's a problem what to do with the briny leftovers. Hard path advocates also say, let's really truly find new water supplies. Well, there are untapped water supplies. Not too long ago, satellite technology revealed that here along this coastline from New Jersey up to Massachusetts, that underneath the ocean's floor, evidently is a huge amount of fresh water, probably left over from the Ice Age. And if you know Florida a little bit, you know off the coast of Florida, we have freshwater springs that are bubbling up in the Gulf and the Atlantic Ocean. One of the best known ones is about 2.5 miles off the coast of Crescent Beach, Florida. But I've talked to people in the water management positions about this, and they say it would cost so much money and it's almost impractical to think you could tap those water supplies. We do have people that want to tap surface waters to meet growing water demands. This is the St. Johns River. It's iconic. It is a scenic river. It's very famous throughout the United States, but it's under pressure to be used as a freshwater supply for Orlando. In the 1990s, there was a business group, 100 friends, a very influential bunch of business people in Tampa that tried to persuade the state legislature to use the hard path principle to put pipes and pump fresh water from water-rich North Florida to Central and South Florida. There was such an uproar that the plans were shelved, but the ideas haven't been shelved. What about storing the water? Well, this reservoir also supplies water for Tampa. It's part of the package of providers. I was out there. It's truly an amazing place to visit. It's a mile this way. It's 2 miles this way. It takes 2 men on power lawnmowers to cut the grass on the perimeter of this. But the problem with reservoirs in Florida are that you have evaporation in a hot place like where we live, and the ground is so flat that it's hard to find suitable terrain. However, some people down in South Florida are looking at the abandoned rock pits, the mining operations, and say, let's use those as basis for reservoirs. Okay, so here's something new. In addition, we're not going to abandon the hard path. We need to use some of those engineering techniques. But there's also a new approach. It's philosophically different. And out in California, it's called the soft path. Here it's called the low impact approach. The philosophical difference is this: provide people with the water they need, not the water they want. And make sure you do so in an ecological and sociological healthy way. Rely less on concrete and steel pipes. Instead, try to conserve, restore, and replicate nature's hydrologic systems. It's also to recognize all water is one water. Right now, a lot of our stormwater is just flushed out to sea. It's wasted. It's still H2O, and it can be reused or recycled. It's the same thing. And we are doing that. Florida is the leader in the United States for using recycled water. Most of it, though, is used on golf courses. It's not suitable for drinking yet, but will it? Maybe. If you're wondering about will your toilet water be converted into drinking water, it's not impossible. There are pilot projects in Florida, California, and elsewhere. In the country of Singapore, they've been doing this for years, and they figure it's the only way they can meet their water demands. Now, it doesn't go directly from your toilet to a water bottle, but it goes to a treatment center, and then it's mixed with other freshwater supplies. But it's recycling. Now, the people I've talked to in the reuse communities say, well, we can take out all the impurities if we want to, except we can take out everything except the hydrogen and the oxygen. And they said their biggest problem is psychological, how to get Floridians over the yuck factor. But you know, astronauts do it, don't they? They recycle urine in their spacecraft. Conservation is another key idea. It has to be more than just know when to water. A lot of people I've talked to say we don't charge people the full price of water. I think all of you out there know about the controversy of bottling companies bottling spring water and then selling it around the world, and they don't really pay for anything except the cost of the permit. Well, it makes me annoyed too. But when I studied all this, I realized we're also culpable. You talk to people in the water industries and they say, nobody really pays the full market value of water. When you get your water bill every month from your local utility, what you're really paying for is the cost of delivery, the cost of infrastructure, and the cost of storage. So even people who live in the company and out of the country, sorry, out in the county and have their own pumps, they should have to pay for that, and their water should be metered if we're going to address these problems. And using tiered water billing method would really help. That means the more that you use, the more you pay per unit. We are seeing the arrival of new technology to help conserve water. Devices like this are appearing on Florida farms and elsewhere to help micro irrigate. We're getting underground detection systems. And in some places that's really good news, because often of the water that's wasted, 40% of it is from pipe leaks under the ground. But we don't always need high-tech solutions. We have neighbors that just got back from Japan, and they showed me this picture of a typical toilet in Japan. If you notice, there's a spigot here and a basin, so people do what they have to do. And when they finish, they wash their hands, and then that is now called gray water stored here. You flush and empty this out with gray water. So you're not using fresh water that could be used for drinking. Instead, you're using it to get rid of waste. We're starting to see some signs of the new way of thinking in Florida. This is Tampa. This is the new green stormwater infrastructure they're putting in. Usually there's just a grate in the concrete, and when it rains, it just goes down the ground and flushes out to sea. But this is a new filtration system. Trying to mimic nature, Orlando should get a gold star. This is an artificial wetland. Years ago, Orlando had to clean up its treated wastewater. So this water you see here has already been in a wastewater treatment facility. And when it came out, it wasn't clean enough to be sent to the St. Johns River. So they planted trees and all kinds of plants that were picked because of their capacity to absorb nutrients or chemicals or other pollutants. They call it polishing the water. The city of Winter Haven is using green natural infrastructure in a spectacular way. And this is a presentation in itself. I think you'd really find it interesting if you went there. 10 or 15 years ago, the city engineers realized, they told me this, that the hard path wasn't going to help them meet their future water needs. Among other things, they are using, instead of concrete and steel, they're using the natural lay of the land. And also, they're not sending their stormwater out to sea, they're conserving it and reusing it. Restoration is also part of the plan to address our water issues. This is at Tamiami Trail, except years ago when I was on it, it was down at ground level. When this was built in the 1920s, it was a spectacular engineering feat, this road that went through the heart of the Everglades. But it functioned in a good way to help people get from here to there, but also functioned as a dam. So there's an ongoing project right now to lift certain key stretches of the Tamiami Trail to allow fresh water to flow underneath and get down south where it needs to be. Over here is a picture of the Kissimmee River, the way it looked until 1962. It was a free-flowing, meandering, serpentine-looking river. Well, people put pressure on Congress to authorize the Corps of Engineers to turn this into a huge canal. The Kissimmee River flows from south of Orlando down to the north end of Lake Okeechobee. The reason they did this, they wanted to dry up this land in order to have more land for farmers and more land for developers. But as soon as it was completed, people realized it was an environmental disaster. So the Corps of Engineers got a new mandate, and they almost immediately they started to fix the damage that they had done. So now there's this restoration project. I think it's the biggest, or one of the biggest in the world, to make this look more like this. Okay, here's something I think will be new for a lot of you. And I'm getting near the end, so thank you for holding on. If I said to you, what do you understand carbon footprint? I think most of you would understand that concept. Well, here's a new one, this water footprint. This idea really got underway in England and Europe, and now it's starting to make inroads in this country. Water footprint is based on the idea of virtual water. Virtual water is the idea that there's lots of water used in the production of goods and services and things that we need that we don't think about. For example, if I were to say to you, how much water is required to make a cup of coffee? You would say, John, that's silly. It takes a cup of water. Not so. Economists who specialize in figuring these things out say, no, it's like 37 gallons of water for 1 cup of coffee. When you take in consideration all the irrigation water, water used for cleaning the coffee beans, and a host of other economic activities. To produce 2 pounds of sugarcane, 475 gallons of water are needed. 47.5 gallons of water needed for cooling the towers at a power plant to produce 10 hours of electricity for a 100-watt light bulb. And this does not include the water that's needed to produce the electricity. That's more. A smartphone may be as high as 3,190 gallons. There are all kinds of estimates about these smartphones, but economists always seem to disagree about their calculations. But I think the good news is it's now being part of their policy considerations. Whoa, there's our grandson, Liam. What's he doing there? Well, our daughter and her husband have a new baby, and they, like other young couples, have to make a decision about what kind of diapers do they want, disposable or cloth diaper. There's a lot of things to consider, but water footprint might be a good one. So let's look at this. The water footprint of 1 disposable diaper is 144 gallons. The water footprint of 1 cloth diaper is 4 gallons because it's reusable at least 50 times. Now, to make both, the cloth diaper required more water, but in the long run, it's more environmentally friendly to use the cotton diaper. In fact, this concept is becoming so important that it's used by policymakers in making decisions about trade. For instance, a country in the Mideast, the policymakers might say, you know, maybe we shouldn't be growing certain fruits because we don't have that much water. It might make more sense to import those fruits from a water-rich country, even if we have to pay more money. And then in the water that we don't use, we can use for other projects and maybe use that water more efficiently. So we can't rely just on the engineering approach anymore. I'm sure we're going to have to use both. And increasingly, I've been told by people I've talked to that the social sciences are now playing a growing role. Disciplines such as anthropology, economics, psychology, and sociology, and philosophy are now being included in making decisions about future water supplies. And philosophy includes thinking ethically about water. Who gets how much water? Do the people of the future have a right to water? Do all living things have a right to water? Those kinds of questions have to be addressed. There are water institutes in Florida that do make a stab at these. We have the University of Florida, the University of South Florida, and Stetson all have admirable water institutes. But something really new is happening down at Florida's Gulf Coast University, a brand new standalone school called the Water School, where these different disciplines are being integrated for the graduates to understand the chemistry, the engineering, the business dynamics, and the sociological aspects of water policy. Well, that's the future, and I think it's also important sometimes to look to the past. I just want to let a lot of you know they get discouraged sometimes. They shouldn't be discouraged because we've had political leaders in the past that did understand our big environmental problems. They led us to establishing very good water policy and environmental rules. We also have seen Floridians rise up and battle together to address a lot of environmental problems. So everybody, not everybody, but most of the people I talk to, when I ask what are the solutions, they all said it's political. And what they meant by that is that we have to find politicians who understand water issues. Get involved yourself. And you don't have to always start your own group. There are plenty that already exists. But it helps if you know what you're talking about. And so I hope my book will address that. So I've finished my presentation, and I appreciate you going with me, and I'd be glad to try to answer any questions that you may have.
And we appreciate your taking the time to share your knowledge with us, John. Thank you so much for presenting today. I'll remind everyone, I sent a reminder in the chat box, but I'll remind everyone now, if you'd like to ask any questions for John, please send those through the Q&A tool. I believe that Lee may have a couple, so I'm going to hand things off to her. Lee?
Yes, thank you so much, John. That was really a great in-depth, deep dive into our water crisis here in Florida. And for those of you that live in Orange County, there's an amendment coming up right now to advocate for the right to clean water. Something I just learned yesterday from interviewing a friend of mine named Chuck O'Neill is that, we as human beings do not currently in the state of Florida have the right to clean water, which means when a corporation comes in and, devastates a spring, we do not really have the legal standings, as far as I know, to file a lawsuit, because at this point, corporations actually have the same rights as individual human beings, but water bodies and elements in nature do not, which I find so surprising. But I just wanted to kind of deep dive into some questions, and we do have one question in the chat. What are some top behavioral shifts that people can do today in order to kind of lessen their water footprint?
That's a really interesting question. And actually, I addressed that in my book because I talked to a professor at the University of Florida who specializes in that. And what the thinking is they take marketing techniques to try to persuade people to buy something or change their buying habits, but redeploy that art of persuasion to convince people to be more concerned about their impact on the environment. Well, one example is what kind of language do you use in your advertising? For example, I'll just use the example they gave me, that if you were to, let's say there's a liberal and a conservative, and you have a community and they've got liberals and conservatives, and you want them to use less water. If you say, let's just do what's right for the environment, the liberals will tend to say, yeah, let's do that. But the conservatives might be a little more reluctant. They might think they're being told to do something, or they're being asked to join the liberal bandwagon. But if you were to say, well, what can we do to make the environment better and more economically feasible and get what we need at a reasonable price and a fair market value without hurting the environment? If you use language that's sensitive to both political natures, there seems to be some success with that. And I think in the Orlando area, also in your bill, I believe this is correct, maybe it depends on where you live, but when you get your electric bill, for example, I think it shows how much electricity you've used in comparison with your neighbors. And places that use that sort of approach say the results are kind of mixed, because in one sense, I don't say shaming is correct, but the idea is if you say, oh, I'm using more than the average amount, I better cut back, that would be good. But if you aren't using as much as your neighbors, you might think, how come those people are using more than me? I'm going to start increasing my use to catch up with them. So they see results in both categories. But I do know that people that, I spoke to an anthropologist who gleaned a lot of her insights by going to countries, developing countries, where water is in short supply, and studying their water ethic in the tribe or the ethnicity, and trying to see what she could glean about human nature. And what she found was, if you can get people to relate to a resource based on the memory that they had of interacting with the water or force when they were a child, or they have some kind of appreciation or fondness for a certain area of the country, they are more likely to be helpful in addressing the problem. That's why I thought it's kind of a problem when you have so many newcomers who come to a place and they've left the place they cherish very often, back in Indiana or California or something like that. So it's not a new discovery that I made. A lot of people have noticed it over the years. But I will say that increasingly using the social sciences to address the things that you brought up. And could I say one quick thing? There's a movement about the rights of nature. It's not just limited to water. It's the idea, does a ecological system have a right? I went to a conference at the University of Florida a couple months ago, and there were people from all over the United States and other countries that were telling about how they're committed to establishing this in the same way that, maybe 10 or 20 years ago, the animal rights movement got underway. This is the next phase, that nature has rights too. But I also, in my book, I talk about the rights that we have, and you're right, we don't have a constitutional right to water. It's not in the Florida Constitution, not in the US Constitution. There's no legislation that says we have a right to water. So even in our water policy, the water management districts are tasked with deciding to approve or disapprove a project based on whether there's a public benefit to a new cattle ranch or a new farm or something. And I think what you're suggesting is that the inalienable right to live needs to be addressed as well. And I would say also for all natural living forms, animals and plant lives and ecosystems as well.
Thank you for that.
Okay.
I wanted to talk a little bit more about that legislation that you brought up back in your spiel, and also to address one of the questions. You said in the 1970s there were some environmental laws that were implemented that have stuck even through till today. I'm assuming there's a lot more that didn't make it or might have shifted through the years. Rick Kilby from the chat wants to know, what are your thoughts on the legislation signed by the governor today? And I'd also like to know, what are some of those environmental laws that have stuck through the years as well?
Well, one that stuck over the years is the establishment of the water management districts. And I think that might be the key. But there's a whole variety of them that address water quality issues and water quantity issues. As far as the governor's concerned, I understand that I'm not sure what the latest is, but I think he kept intact the Florida Forever funding, and that's a good start. I was encouraged when he first was inaugurated that he seemed to be aware of some of the daunting problems that we have. Getting some fresh faces on the South Florida Water Management District was probably a really good start. The people I've talked to concerning whatever the laws are, in fact, just a couple of days ago, I spoke to a friend of mine who is an environmental attorney, and she said it's not the issue of what the laws are, what they call for, is that the laws are sufficient. What's important is the enforcement of those laws. And many people think we are not monitoring the pollution enough, or monitoring the collapse of the water supply system enough, and holding polluters responsible. So it doesn't matter really what the laws say if you don't have political leaders who are committed to enforcing the law. In my book, I interviewed some people who once worked for the state government, and some told me on the record, some told me off the record, of how they were influenced, or pressure was put on them not to enforce Florida's environmental laws. And I think I'll just let readers look at that if they want. But during the Great Recession, Um, Over 565 top administrative officials and scientists were fired from Florida's water management districts and from the Department of Environmental Protection. And so those were really career-oriented people who knew what they were doing. And the funding was cut by $750 million. Of course, there was a recession going on, but those agencies really took a blow. So the laws are still there, but their ability to function has been hindered. And one last thing, we used to have a vigorous growth management program in Florida, and it's been rendered useless, I think, in the last 15 years.
That's really a shame because if
Well, they can be
there's,
brought, these things can be brought back though. I don't want people to shrug their shoulders. You know, our government's only as good as the people we put into it. So people need to run for office themselves, hold people accountable, because yeah, in the 1970s, Florida was actually one of the leading places in the country. It was a shining star. We were pioneering all kinds of environmental crusades. One of the biggest battles was the effort to stop the Jetport project. And some of you maybe never heard of it, but the business community wanted to put a huge airport in the Big Cypress Swamp, right in the heart of the Everglades, and it build a city of 100,000 people and have supersonic planes flying in and out of there. And it would have killed the Everglades. And people reacted. Native Americans and good old boys in Jeeps and scientists and suburbanites all rallied around, not only to stop the project, but as a lot of that land today is, not only did they stop the project, but the land is federally protected with national parks and water conservation areas. So an aroused citizenry really can make a difference. But people have to get in the game. They can't just tweet and they just can't moan about it. They actually have to show up and fight these battles. So I really, knowing about them is not enough either. You have to get in the game. And the purpose of my book is to give you a guidebook to help you get into the game and know what you're talking about. A lot of people are afraid to do this because they're afraid of the acronyms. They're afraid of the power that these people tend to have, or tend to think they have. But you find out they're just people like you and me. And if you can read, you can figure out all kinds of things, and you can be a real water warrior. And I've met a lot of people that made big differences in this state because they did take action. So I hope it wasn't on a bandwagon too much, but I feel very optimistic that way because people are quite capable of solving their problems. They can solve these too, but they need to know what they're talking about and get involved.
well, we have one last question, and before we get to Ms. Milch's question, I just wanted to say some major points to reiterate. Basically, it sounds like we need better water recycling systems. We need to have some resource for holding corporations accountable, whether that's paying more for water so that we have the revenue that we need in order to enforce these environmental laws, or voting for candidates and making sure they take seats in our government so that we can have the ability to have water warriors. And of course, Florida-friendly landscaping is another huge individual act that you can do for those of you at home. Gabrielle Milch has a question about how we can get the problems fixed with our Florida Department of Environmental Protection, WMD, and Department of Health. Rules and permitting is not enforced, just make the polluters in compliance. So,
in full disclosure, I belong to an environmental group that's involved in suing the DEP over not enforcing some of those rules. And it's pretty hard to win because the courts have taken the position that the agencies are the ones that have been given the power to make decisions on our behalf. And unless you can really show they're in gross violation somehow, it's pretty hard to prevail in court and get a judge to agree with you. People do it, and they challenge the rules all the time. it's pretty difficult by yourself to, and it's what I'm getting at. You have to go to court, and what you do is you don't go to a court like Law and Order. You go to something called administrative court, and it's often not even a courtroom, although it is court. And it's more like the principal deciding whether the students are going by the rules or not. So you have a judge who will listen to the citizen's complaint over rule changes, and then they listen to the agency defend itself. And almost always the judge, who might be sympathetic with the plaintiffs, but if you can't prove that, if their job is to say, I mean, for example, if the water code says that a new project is going to benefit everybody because it's a cattle farm and we all eat beef, and the majority of people who sit on the water management board, who are not paid and they're volunteers, by the way, they look at the rules and they say, okay, well, it says here you own the land, you're entitled to a water permit, and it's going to be in the public good. How can I deny this? So maybe if we're really going to change things, we might need to toughen up the water laws of Florida, be more specific about who gets how much water under what conditions, and who's appointed to the boards. Right now, the 5 water management districts have governing boards, and those people don't have to have any background in water at all. I think it's fair to say, I've been told this repeatedly, that for the most part, whenever a new governor comes on board, the governor gets to pick all the people that sit on the water management governing board. They're the ones that vote. And it's usually packed with developers and people with agricultural backgrounds. Some of those governors I showed you, they would include environmentalists and other citizens, but those people have been kind of squeezed out in recent years. Some people think we might need to require people who sit on water management boards to actually have some kind of education in water, and maybe pay them, or maybe we should elect them directly. But when you pick your governor, you're giving the governor to the right to pick those people to all 5 water management districts. The governor picks the head of the DEP. The governor picks the judges in these administrative hearings. There's also I forget exactly what it's called, but an environmental pollution committee that advises the government on water quality issues. And there's 7 people on the committee, and one of them is supposed to be just a regular citizen. Our recent governor refused to appoint anybody to fill that chair. So the governor has a lot of power over water policy, and how vigorous the DEP often comes from the encouragement or discouragement that comes from Tallahassee.
That's incredible.
And that's the way it always is, that way around the world. Politics is just the art of trying to get millions of people to cooperate and address issues and make sure everybody has a fair share of the resources and we don't destroy the place in the process. But if we don't get involved, the people with commercial interests are always going to keep winning.
Yep, exactly. And today, apparently someone from our chat named Mary went ahead and told us about a Solving the Climate Crisis report that came out today from the U.S. House of Representatives. So that's very interesting. So thank you so much, Mary, for sending that over.
Can I chime in real briefly on that?
Sure.
Climate change and sea level rise are so real to the people in South Florida that Miami-Dade has its own climate scientist. They write their own studies. They do their own research, because Tallahassee pretty much has ignored this issue for years. Miami and other major cities have formed compacts. These cities are working together to develop resiliency efforts and mitigation efforts. I think this is amazing, really. Last year, the residents of Miami-Dade, on their own volition, they raised their own taxes. They voted yes to raise taxes to come up with money to try to mitigate the damage to their community from sea level rise. Miami Beach is already spending $50 million to $100 million on pumps because it's getting flooded all the time. If some of these projections actually be as bad as could be expected. By the end of the century, much of the Everglades will be inundated with seawater. Yeah, so I look forward to looking at that study, but there are plenty of studies out there, and they pretty much agree that we are in trouble. And so that's probably the king problem in multiple ways.
Well, thank you so much, John, for sharing your expertise and information on how we can get involved to push things like that in the right direction. It is so important to take an interest in your community, to take an interest in the world around you, and to do something about causes like this. So I strongly encourage everyone to take a look at John's information. I'm going to send out a post-program email to all of you with a handout that John wanted to share. So please keep an eye out for that information. I'm also sharing a couple of links to everyone in the chat box. One is the Center for Health and Wellbeing's Facebook page. If you're on Facebook and you haven't followed us yet, take a moment to like our page. You'll find other upcoming programs as well as a regular live stream of some of our regulars in programming. The second link is for the Daily Well, which is a well-being network initiative. It connects our community and it provides educational programs just like this one to all of our community members. So if you'd like to learn more, go ahead and click right there to see what we're all about. And with that, I will say thank you again, John.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to let me speak to your audience. I appreciate it.
Of course, it was an absolute pleasure to have you. And Lee, from Ideas for Us, thank you so much for moderating the Q&A for us. Awesome job. It was a pleasure to have you here too. And I hope everyone has a wonderful day and look forward to seeing you all again very soon.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, John.
Thanks to all of you.
Thank you.